Well, hello, Forest Meadow, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of our sermon reflections. And there are just a few things that are rolling around in my mind, things that I've been thinking about, praying over, as I seek to apply this principle that's laid down in Matthew 23, apply it to my own life, specifically because I am a leader. And we're going to talk about that as it applies to a leader first off, and then we're also going to see how this principle applies to us no matter what position we're in, no matter what we occupy. We're going to look at how this applies to us because the principle is one that goes far beyond just leaders. It's the principle of humility. And so we're going to look at that for just a few minutes. And so the first thing that really stands out to me that I've been meditating on is how there is a unique temptation for those who are in leadership positions to shirk and kind of evade responsibility for things. And I think many of us have heard this, that the first rule of leadership is it's always your fault. And boy, that is so true. But I want to remind us, those of us who are leaders or those who are aspiring leaders, that this is such a necessary thing. There is always a corresponding burden that accompanies the position of leadership. Now let's think about this. Generally speaking, I mean across the board, when you're a leader of something, you are often more seen, you're often more recognized, people see the work that you've done, and because of that, people are more often, they're more, I guess, inclined to say thank you for what you've done, to recognize what it is that you've done, because everything that you've done is visible, as opposed to the things that are not visible, the ones who are working behind the scenes. They're still so necessary. And you can read about how these gifts work in 1 Corinthians 12 and chapter 14 as well, and how there are gifts that are more visible, those of the face, right? People pay attention to the face, but they don't always pay attention to the feet. And so there's kind of something that we can learn from this, that positions and giftedness that happen to be out front, they get a lot more recognition. And so the Pharisees, sitting in the seat of Moses from Matthew 23, as they sit in Moses' seat, they get the recognition that Moses got. But their temptation, which they failed drastically in, was that they cast off the responsibility. They didn't want this responsibility of really leading and caring for the people. They just wanted the glory that came with the position, the recognition and the praise. And so for those who are leaders or or aspiring leaders, let me say it that way, we must embrace the burden that comes with leadership. We have to embrace it. God will often give us a greater burden upon our shoulders and give us more difficult things. And it's so necessary that God does this for leaders because we have a higher temptation to become proud, to think, man, maybe I am doing a great job. Man, maybe I really should just write my own book and sign it and just put it on my own bookshelf, this type of thing. There's a higher temptation for leaders to become proud and lifted up because we are seen, because we are, so to speak, in the limelight. And so God gives us this hardship, this unique hardship that's there to keep us humble. Now I want us to think about this. Think about Paul the Apostle in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He talks about this burden, right? How God gave him, and his words were, a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble. And what was the purpose? To keep him from exalting himself because of the surpassing greatness of revelations that were given to him. So God had revealed to him such a powerful revelation that he needed hardship. He needed a corresponding burden that would keep him in the place that he was supposed to be. And so Paul's instruction to us is not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment. And Paul's not the only one, nor Jesus, who speaks about humility. It's also Peter. Let me read to you from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. He says this, speaking to young men in the context of shepherding. So these are aspiring leaders, right? People who are still submitted, but perhaps they have a whole lot of frustration in their hearts, right? He says, "You younger men, likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility." Notice how this applies to every single one of us. Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. And then notice what he says after this in verse 7. Casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Let's think about this concept of shirking responsibility. There's also the flip side of that coin, which was taking on too much responsibility that doesn't correspond to where it is that God has put you. Now, I want to think about this from the standpoint of anxiety, right? For those of us who wrestle with anxiety, oftentimes, not always, but most of the time, I would say, we are usually usurping someone else's role. And we might be usurping somebody else's role in trying to fix too many problems that are outside of our reach. And it goes so far that sometimes we actually start to usurp the role of God, and we try to start being omniscient and omnipresent. We try to be everywhere, and we try to fix everything. And the truth is, we can't do it. And these young men who are here, why do you think he might be instructing them to not be anxious? Maybe it's because they are trying to fix things that are outside of their control. There's a whole lot more that's in this, but he's telling them to be subject, and he's telling them that God will exalt you at the proper time when you are ready for this. And so, but here, the anxiety. I wonder why these people who are submitted have anxiety that's there, and why it is they have to bring this before God. Perhaps it's because they are trying to control things that are outside of their control. Perhaps what it is that God is trying to say here is that anxiety is antithetical to humility. Let's think about that. Anxiety and humility don't occupy the same place. They can't. For us to be anxious is for us to try to be doing things, for us to exalt ourselves. It's a version of self-exaltation. And that can happen whether you're in a leadership position or whether you're in a position that is submitted. No matter what position we occupy, we can exalt ourselves. And when we do, we become anxious because we're not very good at controlling everything like God is. We're not very good at being omnipresent, at being all-powerful. And we recognize, I just don't have the power to do this. And the same temptation applies whether you're a leader or whether you're just a child in a home. Whenever we try to do someone else's job, whenever we try to do God's job, we become anxious because we cannot fulfill that role. And brothers and sisters, we're not called to. And so the temptation for each person is to think of ourselves more highly. I can solve that. I should be able to solve that, and I can't do it. And then when the responsibility comes around, for us to cast off that responsibility. But I'll tell you what, if you really want to learn this well, take the responsibility that's yours. Take it upon your own shoulders and say, this is the correct thing. I must bear this burden because God has put me here. And so for me as a leader, I try. I don't always succeed, but I do try whenever God puts me in a position of hardship. I think of my kidney stones, for example, but whenever God puts me in a position of hardship, I try not to see that as an attack from the evil one, but rather as a grace from God that he's using to shape me, to mold me, to keep me in a position where I am humble and submitted to him. Because just like you might have a temptation to take over God's role and be everything and solve everything, I have the same temptation as well. And so brothers and sisters, the key to thankfulness is humility. As we're heading towards Thanksgiving, let's remember to keep ourselves submitted to God. And as we submit ourselves to Him, God will control everything else. He'll exalt us. If we have a problem and it's a legitimate thing, keep yourself humble. And guess what? God will see to it that these things are answered. And the timing, notice, He will exalt you at the proper time. God may solve these things and you may not understand His timetable. I don't understand His timetable, but I'll tell you this. God's a lot better at doing His job than I am. And He's a lot better at His job than you are as well. And so we have to trust Him. It really is such an exercise of our faith and confidence in God. So, brothers and sisters, this is our message for this week. Let's remain humble and submitted to God. And let's not shirk off the responsibility when it's our responsibility to bear, specifically as leaders. And let's not take on too much responsibility that is outside of our control if you're in a position that is submitted. And so the key to all of this, what brings it all together, is be humble. We look up and we recognize who God is, all that He is, and we praise Him for it. And we recognize, wow, Lord, You really do control all things. You really are so good and so faithful and so capable to handle all of this. And so, with that said, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Spend some time with your families. Enjoy that time. It is so precious. And let's be humble together. Our questions for this week are going to be down in the description below. And so I would encourage you and challenge you, please still go through those questions, but they will be posted in the description below. And other than that, we'll see you guys on Sunday. Thanks.